Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Harry with Church of the Eternal Logos, and I am joined by the very special guest made by Jimbob. How you doing today, brother?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me back on. Happy Sunday.
Oh, man, I'm glad that you decided to come back on. For those of you who might remember, my first ever live stream on this channel was back in 2019, the end of 2019, with Jimbob. And boy, was it filled with boomer tech problems. Wasn't even close. I remember it took like 45 minutes just to get the stream going.
Yep.
But anyways, we were a little bit beyond our boomer tech problems today, and I reached out to you because I wanted to have a conversation. You mentioned you're kind of interested in discussing simulation and simulation theory and sort of the consequences of this worldview. So that's kind of what we're going to be getting into, simulation theory. And also, we're going to be talking about symbols at a little bit of a different angle, but within this same context. So it should be a pretty interesting discussion for sure. But before we get going, how you doing? How's the family been? How's things going in your life?
I'm doing great. I mean, I just released the pre-order for my third book of insanity, that's captured in comic meme form, Savage Memes Volume 3. And so it's fun to be able to put that together because this year and a half has been so bizarre. It didn't take much work to fill up another volume of comics. Um, like I tell people now, if you want to be a satirical, expressionist or writer, just be a reporter. Just report on what's going on, and don't even add anything. Just report it how it is, and it will occur as satire. So yeah, just been doing that, and just getting more into painting and live streaming and talking about all of the things that matter to me.
Well, I've been catching actually your streams whenever I can. I always catch your rants on Instagram. They're always fun. And
Yeah.
one of the ones that I caught recently, I thought was really interesting. You were talking about uh, your family, and you were talking about the role of your dad in relationship to your mother in the context of Christianity. And I
Mhm.
thought it was really profound for me listening because it felt like as you've moved into this sort of new space with your own identity, with your own ideas of religion, having your own family, and then you made a subtle critique. Maybe you can explain a little bit more to everybody, to your father, about the role of the man in a Christian-centered family, and he totally accepted that challenge,
Right.
basically.
Yeah. Yeah. It was something I noticed growing up. My mom was always like the powerhouse. She went from super hippie. She went through a Catholic school. I think she got kicked out of Catholic school for behavior or something. Got into Buddhism and Quaaludes and drugs, and then hippieism, and then everything you can do, leading that path to filling that spiritual hole in our hearts that's there. And so she studies Judaism. She is a master at scripture. She just knows the Bible front and back. She has, the cue cards. And it always amazed me. And it always amazed my dad. And it was always something that was clearly, it was a matriarchal sense in the home.
Mm.
And I didn't realize until actually recently, because, I ran off to be an atheist relativist for 15, 16 years. And so when I came back, I realized how important masculinity was, what that meant, the clear, demonstrable hierarchy in the world, of man, woman, child, God, man, woman, child.
Mm-hmm.
That step down, how important that is, and how even when it is attempted to be inverted, it still maintains itself. In other words, like a man who wants to become God becomes a shitty God. Sorry, my French.
Yeah.
A woman who wants to become a man is just a shitty man,
Right.
and so forth. And so you start to see this stuff, and you're like, oh, even the inversion is a mimicry. Even
Right.
the same sex couples are, there's still the reference to the binary of male and female that's always present. And so I started looking at that through the lens uh, of my relationship with God, with the Bible, with Christ, with family, how to talk about this stuff. And you know, I saw that, oh, that was a big missing. My dad was always just like kind of going along with my mom. It was kind of just like, and you see the ramifications of that today, not just with religion, but with compliance.
Right.
Just, oh, everyone's just scared. Just get the vaccine. Everyone's just frightened. Let's just wear the mask and get the vaccines, and and then the man is following the concerns of the woman, as opposed to dealing with the concerns of the woman and leading the woman out of concern, not
Right.
leading her, having her lead. And so this was present in my life, and I never use it against my dad, but it definitely impacted my inability or inaccessibility of my faith. Like, it was inaccessible because I read from my dad, he was just kind of going along with it, or maybe he was just shy about it. And I actually think it was my own jumping back in fully into participation in my faith that got him going. Because I did mention this to my mom, and I mentioned it to him. I said, "Oh, um, there's a definite structure, a reason why that's there, and why the word has to be represented by the man.
Right.
That
Right.
that Christ-like figure is embodied in the man, and then that affects the woman. And yes, you can be Christ-like, I suppose, as a woman, but it's still a sort of a delineation. And so I just started, thinking about that and what that looks like, and started talking about it. And then lo and behold, the next, my dad visited here, and we went to church, and he was just moved, like that I was rescued, that I came back.
Wow.
And so I think that really pushed him into it. And so he did his first sermon, which was like really inspiring. It was like, uh, he focused on how Jesus dealt with sin, and how he was always around the people that you're not supposed to be around.
Right.
Like he never judged them in their hearts. He interacted with them in the embodiment of godliness. And so it was cool to see that, because that's actually something. I'm a very flagrant character. And so I go after people. I use mockery. I probably use some not so Christian words and behaviors. And so I always look at that too. It was not only personal to me that he gave a sermon, or preached, or however you would phrase it. It's that the topic itself it was pretty close to me. He talked a little bit about becoming the Pharisees, and how easy it is for us to become the
Yes.
Pharisees. And
Amen.
ultimately, you have to look in your own family and your own life and your own church first, actually, to see to be, before you become the Pharisees. And then, we were talking about this before we just went live. Is like, brought up the Nas thing and the
Yeah.
sneakers, how easy it is to look at that and become enraged and be like, everything's going to crap, and respond and get hooked on what it's actually designed to do. But the cool thing about what I'm talking about with my dad is that he revealed through that talk, which I got to listen on audio because he's in New York. And I was like, oh, it's so easy as a commentator, as someone who's fighting for the good, revealing the darkness. There's this fine line of pointing the flashlight at it and becoming the Pharisees, like pointing a flashlight versus holding the staff.
Hmm.
I will judge now, but whoosh, and so yeah, it's all very relevant. It's not just personal. That that whole thing happened with my dad, and how like happy I am, and that my brothers, who are a little more separate from God, a little more libertarian, lay off, just let people do what they want to do.
Hmm.
Everything's fine, you know, dude. It's like, I think them seeing that, I can't speculate with how that impacts, but I pray that it does impact, and that there is a distinction between seeing uh, mother preach and father preach.
Right. No, I think it's a really big deal. And the man in the house, the father, I mean, it permeates so many different things: conversion therapy, homosexuality, the proclivity to be sexually attracted to the masculine if you're a man. Well, that's way higher again if you grow up in a household without a traditional father. And so, from a Christian context, the reason why the father has to be the spiritual leader is because it's through the father that we begin to understand who God is. And I mean that not that God isn't also the compassionate, nurturing individual like your mother is. He is also that.
Right.
But when the big difference, when we look at like the Lil Nas X or what's happening to society in a Christian worldview, is boundaries. And the erection, right there we see a phallic description. The erection of boundaries. Discipline itself is a masculine quality, and it is about the erection of boundaries and maintaining those distinctions and those boundaries in society. And so when we look at Lil Nas X and his Satan shoe, him as a man, sexually, grinding on a pole as a female stripper, wearing female stripper shoes, seductively grinding on Satan himself, we see, again, this is all a permeation of boundaries. This is the dissolution of boundaries, because it's through the dissolution of boundaries we get epistemological relativism. And then if we are in a spiritual reality, that's how Satan convinces people he doesn't exist. Because there is no delineation between good and evil. And I think that the fact that Lil Nas X, then he has so many children as his following, that's what I see that is leading people into. It is just that whole culture of relativism, of the permeation of boundaries, and that boundaries themselves are perceived to be bad and often patriarchal, and therefore often racist or xenophobic or however you want to frame it, because they can't have boundaries.
Right. Yeah, you see it everywhere. It's rampant with the man who's like, well, I don't want to get in the way of you terminating my baby. It's like, I would never, step over that boundary. That's that's your body, your choice. Like the thing is that we all want, that's what's so funny about it, is we all want the boundaries, and we all actually strive for the distinctions. And so even in the inversion that we see with all things, the attempt to deceive or to invert reality and forms and distinctions and words and the law of identity, in the attempt to do so, you actually appeal to all of it, because you're saying something exists to flip. By saying, in a way, all of this spiritual warfare is all it is just stronger argumentation for good and evil existing and for God. So it's just like a funny, that's why looking at it from my perspective and not reacting the way they want you designed to react, which is economically, actually. It's like a very well-established outrage economical structure that you can see and actually point to, where it's like these things have cascades, they have worthwhile limelight that can be turned into mini economies, and it's about in this case it's sneakers, it's music. How do we draw up this, how do we drop the dust, and I mentioned to you before, like when a plane takes off, it actually with speed and velocity meets the resistance of the wind, so there's opposition that actually pushes the plane up. So you got to be careful when we all go after the satanic culture that's just permeating, like, drastically, like really quickly everywhere. It's like there's this balance between calling it out and then giving it extra power, because it is ultimately has no power, truly.
Right.
It can have power over you if you reject the truth. If you toy with that, you will get burned by it. But it itself has no real properties. It's just the inversion of something. It's just like a shadow. Like you're dealing with a shadow or a shell of something, a vessel, an empty vessel. So it's like, I see a lot of people. My big following is probably mostly right wing, and then center, and then a bunch that just despise me. But they all just do the same thing. It's this big, crazy response. Oh, look at this Nas, we gotta stop this. And I was just talking to you before we got live, is like this crazy dance that we do between living a spiritual life, living a moral life, living a Christ-like life, calling out nonsense and inversion and evil, and standing up for the good and pursuing the good. And there's a fine line between that and becoming pragmatic, becoming utilitarian, fighting in their worldview. And it's like, the big argument for, in our view, that the best argument for God is a transcendental argument. It's the argument that anything can be argued at all, like that that knowledge is even discernible.
Yeah, let's get down to brass tacks here if we're going to be
Exactly.
talking about God.
Exactly. And so because that's ultimately what we're dealing with when we even make a truth claim or try to discern what good and evil is. We're starting from that appeal to transcendental, the category itself, and what justifies who justifies the category. And as you pointed out before we started in our little chat, is that by appealing down to the worldliness of Lil Nas and operating and fighting in the world, in the worldliness on their playing field, you don't fight evil on the pragmatic and on the worldly playing field. You fight it spiritually. So it's either prayer, church, being kind, forgiveness, moving with hearts, not with information, with hearts. And so in a weird way, you pray for that guy, and it's not weird. It's just that you're operating on two. If you're truly looking at it for what it is, there's no, we got to stop Lil Nas. There is no, it's stop what?
Exactly.
Evil is not identical to these people. Evil is not identical to the material, and we can't trap it, move it, suffocate it. No, maybe the closest I can get at in an abstract way is saying we can shed light in darkness because there's only light, and then there's the absence. And so we move with light to darkness, and it doesn't burn people. It just lights where it's dark. And so you can point to all the light, but there's nothing to fight. There's no one to fight in the world out there. You're going to get caught in a trap, and the trap is, you end up fighting evil the same way, let's say, William Craig argues for religion. And it's like, you're still in that foundation.
You're not going to have real change. I mean, that's, again, if we believe the creed and the theology of Christianity, God became man to show us how it is we actually affect reality. How do we change the world? And you do that by actually engaging with a single person face to face, by looking them in their eyes and being totally honest and actually caring about them.
Right.
Novel idea.
Right.
But that's actually how you change the world. And so when I look at Lil Nas X, as we were talking about, what we can see the evil. It's clearly present, but what exactly are you going to fight? I mean, clearly the guy, and we all have addictions to some type of sin. We're all sinning. Right, so we're all plagued by the same ill he is. Now, he may be engaged in ones a little bit different than ours, and clearly the attachment to those normalizes the things to be grinding on Satan in hell, right? So what do you fight? What are you going to do? You're going to beat him with a Bible? What exactly do you do?
You're going to make Christian Nike shoes?
Yeah.
It's like,
and Nike would be more than happy because they'll make money either way.
Yeah, no, it's that's the thing. It's like I get a lot of positive feedback through these through speaking about it in this lens, because I talk about it in my live streams a lot, and people want answers. They want to know. They want to know who the red coats are, so we can have a war, and then we can end that, and finally we'll have a good nation that's proper and all bundled up and perfect.
Which is still utopia in the world.
It's the same.
The problem.
It's worldliness, and people don't like it because they're like, no, what are we? Oh, easy for you to say, Jimbob. You're just going to draw pictures and make people laugh and raise your kids good and do all the things you're supposed to do in life. But how are you going to measure it? Like, now, it's like we don't actually get to measure it. Like, if we're living the moral life, the argument is, it's not, we can't define, we don't get to define what that spreadsheet looks like. As much as we think we know, or I have a pretty good idea of how good I was. Like, No, you're ultimately in faith all the time, just constantly, like, and that's moral. That's fighting the good. You're still playing a faith-based game. And so, there's this weird humility, um, this thing where humility might get interpreted as defeat or cynicism.
Mm-hmm.
And I've referenced this before, how at some level of argumentation, the nihilists, the atheist materialist, their stance could sound like a Christian,
Mm-hmm.
if you don't get to if you don't get to the appeal to God and
Right.
faith. On its face, you're two people, one an atheist, materialist, nihilist, and one is a Christian. Without appealing to the faith part, if you start at one spot, they're arguing the same thing in a way, that this is just worldliness. Like, this is all temporary. This is,
Right.
in a way, it doesn't matter, but compared to what?
Right. And one
the
person, that's a perfect analogy. One person is attaching their identity to that world. The other person is not. And so the
Right.
Christian, though we both recognize the transient, limited existence of creation, or for an atheist, just the universe.
Right.
But how it is that we approach the how do we form our identity? So Marsh Mcluhan, I've been talking a lot about Marsh Mcluhan lately on my channel. He talks about how identity is found through violence, and he talks about how this is true for the majority of history, the majority of the world, and that people gain their identity through violence. This is one of the problems with war. This is one of the problems with masculinity itself. And so Christianity is calling us to have an identity in the opposite of that, to not be violent in the world, which is how every nation establishes their boundaries, how every nation establishes their own creeds, their identities, that somehow that walking in faith, that is such a big idea, because it's and it takes such a long, for me, it was intellectual to get to the point to no longer have a religion that is all intellectual. Because really and it sounds like this is even a difference just from the last time we've talked. I can just tell by the way you're speaking that you're in a different place spiritually in the way that you're seeing things. And it's like, it's difficult to get people who know you, who know about you or your journey. And now you're in this place. It's just like you're talking about, that you realize, gosh, I can't do anything. Anything that I actually tried to go do in the world for the purpose of the good, it's going to come short. The only way I can do is actually just return back to myself, try to connect with God, and then whatever I can glean from that, put that out into the world through one-on-one connections with individuals, with persons. And that's, to me, that's so powerful, because now your life, there is a sort of adventure to it.
Right.
I've been trying to be a good Christian, but I have terrible problems with patience. And I'm always wanting to make things happen in my life. Right. And so again, that faith part, walking in faith, letting go of, again, this idea of me going out into the world and making, I want this, I'm going to do this. I'd rather put the responsibility on my shoulders. And then so what am I? I'm a Christian, but now I'm so still in the world. There's not a whole lot of difference, getting back to the original point, between me and the atheist.
Yeah. Yeah. If you get pulled into that, that being your measure, or really at the end of the day, if you put your measure in the world, it's not just that you're trying to identify the good with the material. It's that if a byproduct of measuring the good in material is that you become the arbiter of the measure.
Yes,
you're the one looking at it.
Exactly.
And so it's a trick.
Point.
It's like those two don't ever go not hand in hand, in other words. So it's like the moment you place it in material, you become God, because you're making the judgment on it, and you're going, I did it. And then people do this with Christians. We all do this. Like, someone would be like, well, what are you doing? And you're like, well, I'm a Christian, and I raised my kids good, and all these check marks, I'm the good, I did it. And ultimately that's another trap, because you're still in faith that you're doing it. You're still in humility, hoping, praying that you're doing it, that you're that you're abiding by, that you're doing your best that you possibly know to do, and you're calling out the moments where you fell short. You're acknowledging those things. You're acknowledging the sin and all of these things as you go, as opposed to you already know the answer. You just need
Right.
a board and then a blank board to make the marks, and
Right.
measure them monthly, and be like, you guys, look
Get
what I
your
did
Excel
this month.
sheet.
Yeah. So yeah, it's just worldliness. It's just us being humans. Like,
Right.
uh, how do I do good? How do I do good out there? You got to make things happen, and it's very. I mean, a lot of that is based in. I mean, you would know more than me, but there are other faiths,
Hmm.
other religions that try to ground the path to God through good works or reasoning or thinking or
Right.
something where it all add up. Just try to do okay, and you'll get there. It's like a, and it's just I don't see that the logical way or the way we find any peace, because if we're the ruler, it's funny that the term ruler too, like when we're the ruler, we assume we're the ruler, like the ruler, when we are the one who define the measure, we're also the ruler. Like,
Right.
we're neither. We're neither the measure of good, the measurer, or the creator.
Right.
We don't get to define or in a way measure it.
And that is real humility, right? So the fact that that vantage point that you're just describing is real humility, because you're recognizing your human limitations, and ultimately that theologically that's going to lead to then trying to align your will with God's will. And that leads perfectly into our discussion into the simulation theory,
Right.
because it's doing the exact opposite. And so simulation theory is another skeptical hypothesis about the fundamental nature of reality, which we see throughout world religions. You can look at Maya, the concept of Maya, in the Sanskrit notions, both within Buddhism and Hinduism, that reality is fundamentally illusory. So we see these physical forms, these physical presentations. We can touch, we can interact, we can have experiences, but all that's ultimately illusory, and you're just going to reincarnate. You're going to come back at another time based on your karma and all this different stuff. So that's also tied to another version of the illusionary reality, somebody like a Zhuangzi in Taoism, the butterfly's dream, the idea, which, if you're not aware, this is a very famous work in Taoism. He has this poem called The Butterfly's Dream, where he wakes up, and the dream is that he was a butterfly dreaming about being a man. And then he wakes up as a man, and he can't figure out, was I a butterfly dreaming about being a man, or am I a man dreaming about being a butterfly? And so this again is hinting at that the fundamental nature of reality is a dream, again, illusory. Simulation theory has built upon these, right? So it's a new form. It's a 21st century, or 20th century, really got going in science fiction, form of the same concept, right? That fundamental reality is illusory. However, simulation theory, unlike Maya, unlike the dream world, that's actually in charge of somebody. That's actually under the aegis of man. And so
Right.
now that brings in a whole new context of looking how simulation theory is promoted in our society, how our society believe, take an Elon Musk, take the Bill Gates, take many of these technocratic world leaders, and they do believe themselves to be God because they don't believe in the transcendent, even though obviously they're using logic and numbers and all this stuff, but we don't have to go there. So man is God in those worlds.
Hmm.
And that world is a simulation. It's a planned out mechanism. It is ultimately false. So, I have a few things that I want to get into in regards to this topic. I don't care where would you like to begin in regards to the problem with simulation itself. So maybe this would be a good starting point. Is assume reality is simulated. How would I know that? And if I know that, is the knowledge of the simulation a simulation? Now we
Right.
get into a tautological problem in and of itself. How do we know
Yeah,
anything?
that
How,
crushes it right off the bat. You don't even have to go further if you're arguing against simulation theory, because it's reduced to reality is illusory. And of course, Jay Dyer pointed this out in many different streams with a little piece of paper, where it's like the moment you say reality is anything, you're starting from a place that it's not illusory. Something must not be illusory to make the statement reality is illusory, because something needs to be stable and pure in its form and non unchanging and non illusory. So you can't even make the claim reality is. The first two words already refute the claim. Something must be steady. Something must be firm in its existence, in its um, in its state. You just got, like otherwise it's always, you could never know.
Right.
And then it's like you'd have to stand outside of a simulation to say that's a simulation. Then you get into a big problem, because then how would you know standing outside wasn't a part of the simulation? It's endless regress. It's nonsensical.
It is.
But then there's another problem there, because once you're standing outside of the simulation, or let's say you're not standing outside the simulation, you say it's a simulation. A simulation is mimicking something that is. So what is?
The reality.
So what are you simulating?
Exactly.
Well, the simulation. No, you don't get to just say we're in a simulation without discerning what's being simulated.
Right.
We don't know. Well, then you can't say it's a simulation. What if, it's like, you're always going to be left asking, are we still in it? Are we still in it? Are we still in it? But like you're saying, the kind of irony of it all is that the belief in it and the acceptance of it, just without logical criticism, philosophical criticism, the people will accept themselves as God inside of a simulation of what this reality is,
right,
or the things we can think in this reality. So while people accept, and culture kind of tries to push this idea, we're living in a simulation. As they're doing that, the technology that actually allows a simulation to be built of this reality, mixed, layered with fantasy, you name it, anything. I was thinking about this the other day, and I was like, man wants to become God. Now, there's this, when we hear that statement, we think, oh, the man wants to be the ruler of everything. They want to conjure anything at will. They want to destroy, dismantle anything at will. They want to create their own rules, and all of this, so on and so on. They want to create punishments. And so it's crazy that the pursuit of the pursuit of becoming God will ultimately mimic the godliness that we know. In other words, there will be a simulated hell, potentially in our lifetime, where a prisoner may actually go into a virtual reality, persistent hell-like state with a helmet on,
right,
with senses, with everything, with smell, sensory, total, like if they can do it, they will try. People will, who want to become God, will do this. And the same goes for whatever their version of heavenliness is, which of course will probably be based on a Sam Harris like model of good and evil, which is suffering and pain is bad and evil, and pleasure and all of those things is good. And so you'll have these extreme worlds of simulated realities that are simulating things that are actually not exactly in reality, but conceptually in reality, like torment, like being able to mimic these things, but in ways that you couldn't experience them in reality. So a lot of freaks will spend most of their time with cartoons, their whole life in a world, anything you can conjure. But the fun part is for the Christian is that that it's Faustian. Why? Because you're not moving. It's going to be muscular dystrophy. There's going to be the fact that you think you're God. Like the moment all humans on Earth have the capacity technologically to experience that they are their own God, we could remove ourselves from that position and look on at these people, and they will all have helmets on with these cords, and they'll be stagnant in one place, and they'll ultimately all be slaves to appetites,
Right.
but not just metaphorically, not the way we know that's true today. We're slaves to our conveniences and our appetites. I mean direct. I mean,
Right.
like, they're permanently
Right.
in a
Machine to
state.
brain interface
Yeah,
of appetite
straight up.
fulfillment.
Right. But the reality is not that. The
Right.
Faustian deal is you're actually a permanent slave to your own lack of discipline, your own uh, out of touchness with what is real, what is true, what is beautiful. It's all inverted, it's all fed to you. And there are large projects that are on board with this. If you look up a lot of stuff, you look into the Keck Institute, you look into the Brainbow connection, I think it's called, like the Rainbow Connection, Brainbow. Um, CERN, all these transhumanists, they're all trying to get into the brain, into the body, for this reason, that they have this sort of like masturbatory view of the human consciousness as one thing, and if they could just connect it all, then
Right.
we'll all just be one being, and we will become God, uh, by way of simulating a singularity, which
Right.
of course we wouldn't know where we were unless someone was standing outside. So
Well, and one of the things that I was thinking about in regards to just reading on some of the simulation theory and what these theorists think is how sure they are of all this stuff. Yet, if we actually just get into the academic literature, nobody knows what consciousness is. If we just go to an established field, right? So simulation theory isn't that well established. We just to move over to theory of mind and philosophy. Well established. Been doing it for a couple hundred years now. No idea what consciousness is. So it's like this whole simulation theory is just it's built on like sand, but the sand's not even there. I
no,
guess
they
it's
don't even have that
simulated.
part. Yeah, yeah. They don't have consciousness. They talk about all this stuff. I mean, they reify so many things now. I've been paying a lot more attention to like science, what's being presented as science, how it's been. There's a plurality of it now, where it's like science used to be a method, but now it's a body of knowledge,
Yeah,
and all this stuff. And it's always this reification fallacy, where
right,
it's this misplaced concreteness of an idea, consciousness, dark matter, gravity, evolution. It's all of these simulated models that
exactly.
have
Yes,
that
that
have us on board, and you're like, oh, it's a model, like, it's a model, and you're like, what's a model? Is just the absence of an experiment.
no,
That's it.
this is perfect because I wanted to get into this was the next avenue in regards to the simulation. So you just brought up all these different conceptual realms that we then build ideas off as if they're foundationally true, right? Macro evolution. Well, shoot, we can actually prove that can't be right just based on probability, statistics, and mathematics. So we don't even have to get into all this stuff. Just if you, do you believe in math? Oh, you believe in math? Okay, so using mathematical formulas, we can, Earth would have to be way older than 13.8 billion based on your own timeline.
Right.
And so it's like the simulation for me, the simulation theory is the simulation. That by adopting the simulation theory, you're already sort of pre programming your own behavior, your own attitude, your own presuppositions to reality itself. And if you look into this stuff, the scholars who promote it believe that. They say, well, in a simulation, if we had people in a simulation, they wouldn't have to worry about saving money, right? They wouldn't have to worry about disease. They can live in the immediate moment. They can enjoy all the. Okay, so again, your argument is rooting people back into hedonism, just
Right.
pure pleasure. And as you're saying, this is the simulation to me is predictive programming. So it's not to me because if we're going to use logic and probability and statistics, and let's look at and analyze this idea, right? Elon Musk says that this was his logic for it. This is on Joe Rogan that if you believe in the evolution or progress of video games, well, then you have to believe that at some point, basically, video games are going to be indistinguishable from reality. And it's like, well, that's a category error.
Yeah.
Just because a video game's improving, that is entirely a different category than the nature of reality itself.
Yeah, I saw that too. I thought it was absurd. I wonder if he even knows it's absurd, or he's just like, they're just like, Elon, your job is to be Iron Man in real life. Your job is to be like the cool bad boy who gets funding in science to a perpetual level where it's unquestioned forever. And it's like,
Yeah.
I think I could do that. You could potentially be a butterfly, with the mRNA. Probably. I mean, it looks so fake, but it's real. And it's like all he's doing is just doing like, spokesman shit.
Right.
He's just being a body that argues for the vagueness of these ideas. He probably knows it's nonsense. I mean, maybe it's
Right.
like that's the other part is like you never know with these guys
Right.
because
You
it's
can't
so
trust them.
absurd.
You can't,
So yeah,
based
you
on
can't
their own
trust.
worldview, you can't trust them because the only thing that matters is ultimate power. That's the
Right,
only thing that they themselves believe in.
right.
And
And then and if you're dumb enough to buy it, it's your fault. So
yeah,
it's like they almost hate their own. So it's almost like that sense you got with those old comedians, whether it was like Kinnison or Hicks, where you almost could feel a palpable distaste for their own audience, where it's just like you're like, how are you not, like you deserve to be misled, if you're this dumb, you know
right.
what I mean?
Right.
You
And, and
know,
and that's how the people who, so again, for me, and then Neil deGrasse Tyson, he says simulation theory is basically 50-50 at this point. It's
based
like,
on
dude, what
what?
are you talking about? You can't even make, what the hell? Like,
That reminds me of when Ben Stein interviewed Richard Dawkins. He was like, "So what? So what? Why are you so sure that God doesn't?" He's like, "Well, I'm not exactly. I mean, it's more like 50%, or at least 90%." He's like, "Based on what?" He's like, "Oh, I don't like numbers. I just it's probable. It's highly improbable that there's a creator." And he's like, "Based on what? Like." He did the best job. Like Ben Stein was just deadened and going like, but based on what? And he couldn't answer. And it's the same with Neil Tyson Dishmushnash, I call him. He's just this. He's just like, I don't see any good argument that it's not a simulation.
yeah,
And you're
that's
like,
just, what?
law of identity.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, and the problem is these guys never get in front. This is how I know that there really is an authorized media complex, whether it's right leaning conservatism
Right.
or what have you. It's all very much protected, and so that true knowledge, theology, logic, philosophy is pushed out, and only the accepted fringe versions of it allowed
Right.
to sprinkle in here and there. And I'm a philosopher, I'm an astronomer and a philosopher. It's like these guys, they are supposed to represent science, scientific truth, empiricism, and yet they spend most of their time making large truth and philosophical claims and claims of Atelios, of like where we ought to go, which is
Yep.
not scientific, and nobody calls them on it. Yeah, they get on Joe Rogan, they get on all these places, and nobody goes, yeah, but based on what? Like no one asks like a sharp, sharp question that stops them in their tracks. It's just almost like that's a whole other aspect of what we're dealing with, is that it makes sense that people would be open to a simulation because in a way reality is not a simulation, but you can simulate a reality in reality.
Right.
So that's where things get tricky. It's like
Yes.
what it could be. And what you just said is by accepting simulation as a reality, you then accept all realities that are presented. You couldn't refute them. You just have to say, well, no, it's just a different simulation.
Yeah.
And
It's
like,
a cultural variant. It's
yeah,
another cultural simulation.
exactly. It's the same as like, everything's a construct, and all these other terms, which are again are self-refuting because then then that claim would be a construct and couldn't be true either. But the
And
simulation theory, it makes total sense why people buy into it. It's not just they might not even be aware that it's a rejection of ultimate truth.
right. I would think most people aren't who actually believe
No,
that.
they're just like, no, it's cool. It's like it makes sense that we live in a digital reality.
Yeah,
And,
progress is tied to it, so they see themselves as
right, progress.
progressing. And
Mhm.
also, I think that there's also a sense of security, right? Because of the unpredictability of reality. That, whoa, if reality is simulated, or I can get in my own simulation, or I can upload my consciousness to a computer, well, then again, it's utopia again. It's utopia back in this world. It's like, oh, I can have everything I want and everything I don't like. I don't have to deal with it. And it's just continual pushing away of the confrontation of reality, right? That eventually, to become human, you have to confront the difficulty of what reality actually is.
Yeah.
And so we already have a neotenized population. Neoteny is just a biological term for an animal that retains juvenile characteristics into adulthood. So if you have pigs, you keep them in a pen, they're all pink because that's how they're born. But you let them go, they become wild, their skin changes color. That's a neotenized characteristic. And so what's happening to us as a species when most men are neotenized? So you see the soy face, like, to me, these are all neotenized forms of, I was going to talk about, dog parents, how dogs are now, again, we elevate animality to humanness. We lower humanness to animality. And now, again, there's the beauty of parenthood is demolished because the homosexual couple can own their chihuahuas, their parents, the lesbian couple that adopted the black boy from Africa, their parents. And it's like, so what's going on? Again, relativism. And so for me, the simulation theory is the virus. And just think about playing Sims, right? That's how the people, I think, at the top view much of reality, view much of us. We are the sim characters. Therefore, you're expendable. Go ahead and get your vaccine. It's not a big deal. We need to lower the population. We need to control. We're in control of life and death now. Sorry. And so if you still pray to God, you're probably just backwards and ignorant.
Right.
And what you're talking about, go ahead.
And the simulation thing, you were saying it removes you from facing reality, but even at the moral level, you're free of everything. There's no consequences.
Yes. Oh, great point.
Or death. There's nothing after. It's a sim. They'll probably be resurrected, as some other thing digitally. They want to think this. And it's going to, the convincing, even though it's not a convincing, logical, perspective, it can be broken with every form of logic. It destroys it. But the problem is people don't necessarily respond to what's logical or what's coherent. They're going to be hit with worlds of new tech that enable them to represent their realities in any customizable way. Their own face on everything, their own face in every movie that they see, whatever they want, the deep fake technology that's going to disrupt a lot of things. People think a nonsense, the Karonka is disruptive, or masks, or oh man, the future is going to be pretty disruptive with tech, and it's going to be like entertainment based disruption, which is usually not on people's radar. They're like, oh no, it's going to get really cool, but it's going to, you think Nas is a horror show. The kind of intrusion with conjuring near lifelike representations holographically, with the faces, with bodies, whatever, is going to really give people a playpen that, it's going to be a level of absurdity. So it really does make sense that people adopt the simulation idea, because that means they can create whatever they want, and there's no consequences, and they can live, it's like the ultimate merger between sort of like the left utopian and the libertarian hedonist,
right, as
one. It's just like, it's perfect. There's going to be no war because everyone's going to be in a headset. There'll only be digital war, and that's good. How can you argue against that? It's like,
right,
why don't
hear people say that?
Lobotomize everybody?
Right.
Why don't we just take it to its logical end, where there's no confrontation of any kind in reality? And that's the ultimate argument against someone like a Sam Harris, who's like, well, how could you argue that suffering is something we shouldn't avoid? It's like if the good is equal to not suffering, then lobotomizing everyone and removing the pain receptors and anything that equates to torment or suffering in the mind, you just remove all of that and make us meat sacks. And Sam Harris, you have your heaven on earth. look at it, and you look at it, and it's just drooling, a bunch of drooling, tipped over people, just skin sacks. At least we're not suffering.
Yeah, I know. In that again, so that what does Christ tell us to do? The exact opposite. That if you want to become free in this world, you actually have to suffer. That's why he asks us to bear your own cross, right? Follow him and carry your own cross. And so again, if you're working under the presupposition of Christianity, it's telling us to do the exact opposite of what the simulation, of what the world, of what the entire momentum
Right.
of where we're at right now, where that's going. Christianity is saying do the exact opposite. Care for people that you don't like. Work on a one-to-one level. There is no such thing as loving something that isn't also able to love you back.
Right.
That doesn't exist.
Right.
And yet that's what so many people are sold, right? The social justice warrior loves the world, loves humanity, loves social justice, a modifier on just, so not justice, but social justice. And they're all abstract concepts. This is a way in which I see evil manipulating the good intentions of ignorant people.
Oh,
Right?
Absolutely.
It's
I mean,
not that they're bad people. They want to be good people. It's just
right.
they want to be good by doing it in the world. They want to virtue signal, which again, I understand, virtue signaling that's called the Pharisee. That's throughout the tradition. There's always those people. And it just seems like they just get easily just a little bit, and you can be totally misled, misguided, moved, and you just like playing golf, you just off a little bit, but that ball where it ends, it's so far away from your destination.
Totally. Yeah. And all of that, that whole theme of like hijacking the good in us, the part of us that wants to see good and create or maintain good in the world. It makes people vulnerable, because then you can sell the John Lennon song, and you can sell, We Are the World and U2 and all of these cultural concepts that come right into that vacuum. I mean, the Oprahs of the world, the Bill Gates of the world. It's a vacuum that we want filled, and we know, many of us know, the only way it can be filled. But people are drawn to the material filling it, and they're like,
Right.
well, can't we please create goodness in the world, and stop the stop this, stop that, stop the hungers. And it's all just like, it's basically, I mean, like we said in the beginning, it's just the moment you would try to adopt that abstract notion of what that is. It's like, how can there be an abstract notion of Christ-likeness? Christ-likeness is a beingness. It's a wholeness of all that God is in a human. And that's how we know.
Fulfillment of like the full potentiality of humanity.
Yeah.
God had to incarnate, because we couldn't fulfill that. We couldn't fully express who we were created to be. So God bridged that, so now we can participate in divine nature. That again, so Orthodox theology is a bit unique on this for those of you listening. That theosis, the idea that the point of the Christian life, the whole point, so we don't have to get into all the specifics, the whole point, though, is to engage in the energies of God, which are logic and reason and love and truth and honor and glory and all these things that we know are good. You can't touch them, though. You can't see them. We believe those are literally uncreated energies coming from the Logos, and that we can become more like the Logos by engaging in those energies. The more we engage in those, the more we become synergized by them. And so that is a totally different understanding and approach to these ideas, to the relationship to God. And so the theosis idea, which I believe to be true, look at New Age, look at the spiritual but not religious, the idea of becoming God, Illuminism. It's not that you're not, again, from my worldview, the intention the whole time of God was for you to become like God. But just the little bit distortion, the little misunderstanding, the little manipulation by the father of lies, and all of a sudden, no, you're the God. You are the universe aware of itself. You are the creator, but you've chosen to become John X, and that's why you can't remember that you created the universe.
Right. Yeah. We are our own gods. I create morality. Yeah, that's what's his name? James True. I don't know where he's doing.
Oh my gosh.
I
Yeah.
hope, I wish him well, and I hope he finds truth. But
Pray
yeah,
for him.
that's everywhere. That's everywhere. That
Right.
whole, it's oneness. You know, you're God. I'm God. It's like you're God. I'm God. We're all God. It's all one thing. I'm like, I disagree with you then. And
Right.
they're like, damn, like who's God now?
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
who's God now?
Exactly. It's so it just a little bit, just push it a little bit. And the dominoes fall apart. Like
Boom.
the Jenga set falls down. There's
Yeah.
nothing there. And yet people, I think, and this was for me too, I'm speaking for everybody, but the way that, at least from my experience of trying to get out of those worldviews and then into Christianity, the difficulty is letting go of the allowance of all the sin. That
Right.
within that worldview, within the psychedelics, within the new age, within the spiritual but not religious, within the occult, I can have as much sex as I want with whoever I want. I can take as much drugs. There's still this idea of being good to people, but it's kind of wishy-washy. And so you exist in that, and maybe you are pursuing truth, but the real hurdle, and I think a lot of people don't jump, is if the movement of your life is moving towards Christ, eventually you have to start giving things up. And that's the hard part. And I think some people really just don't want to do that, or they're too engrossed in those activities. And so, again, from our theology, engaging in the activities that aren't the energies of God, it
Yeah.
darkens your perception. You
Yeah.
literally can't see reality. It's called your nous. It's considered the eye of your heart or the eye of your soul. And when you engage in sin, your nous becomes darkened. And so there's this feedback, right? That, again, we're always existing. We're either darkening ourselves or we're lightening ourselves in everything that we do. We're either moving towards God or we're moving away. And I think for some people that get in these spiritual worldviews, one, I think maybe they're too dark in the way that they can perceive the world, that they can't actually see truth. I think that's
Right.
I think that is why the left can't meme.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Literally.
Well, how could you meme truth if your
You
basis
can't
of
see it.
everything is relative?
Right.
There is nothing that can maintain. So your meme of truth would have to change the next month. Everything you thought was true is no longer fashionable, and so it just goes into But what you were saying about the I think this is fundamental thing that people deal with. How there's a lot of libertarians who are atheists, and they think, well, I can have a sense of morality. It's just like they take the Ayn Randian approach, where it's just like, well, pursue your own interest, and as long as you don't hurt anybody else, then you are good. And it's like, no, sin and morality must also necessarily impact the one to yourself. That a sin is an act against yourself,
Right.
and so that's still consistent with you being made in the image of God.
Exactly.
Not just the act against, because an act against another isn't just an act against God and another, it's an act against yourself also.
Yes.
And so there's always an act against yourself. And so it's always like this.
Which makes that psychedelic revelation, oh, we're all one, we're all
yeah.
And again, that's what I'm saying. It's like the more I get into Christian theology, it's more as like you see how these general ideas, they are true. You just have to understand it this way. Now you can put a framework around it where you can understand that can be the case. And people just get into these, it's just a little misunderstanding. And now you're in a totally different worldview. You're totally convinced of the validity of that because there is some truth in it.
Because of course, it's borrowed, it's model. I mean, that's why someone like Peterson is such a runaway success. He's taking the appropriate amount of truth in format and delivering the sort of material truth, the intellectual sort of accessible, palatable truth of philosophy or Jungianism and things that people are already into. They're, oh, cool. Oh, he made it cool to be, in a way, he made it cool to be Christian, but not by faith. He made it cool to behave consistent with a model that represents truth, but isn't identical to truth, isn't identical to the good. It's just a pragmatic, as I call it, it's like he was like, I want to play Mortal Kombat. It's like a game of Mortal Kombat, and I think that's an appropriate title. And it's like, I don't want to pick the Asian guy or the other guy who throws the spear and, the other guy who freezes people. If I were to play a game and if life is Mortal Kombat, if I were to choose an avatar for pragmatic reasons, it would be Christ. And it's like, it's just an argument for utility. It's
Right.
not faith-based, but he represents, I'll go after him hard because he influences, and he represents that the broadness of application of maybe theology, of
Right.
maybe something's out there, but let's just keep it in this envelope called applicable to my direct goals and interests
Oh,
today.
I want to stay right here on this topic because again, we went private back and forth privately on the Jonathan Paggio Jordan
Uh-huh.
Peterson conversation, and that's exactly it. It's like he used, and Jordan is on his own journey, and I think, and I don't know where he's going to get. He has his own free will. Who knows how he's going to choose it? But it does seem providential, the way that he seems to almost be an example. So many people have their eyes on him right now, and his journey is that now he's to a place that his life fell apart, despite having 12, 24, 36 rules. Doesn't matter how many rules he has. And it doesn't matter how close he is to the archetypal truth of something, because he does use true things that are archetypally true. He speaks about true things that are in mythology, but like you said, everything but the theology of it. So you use the pragmatism, the utility, the sociological advantages that if you have a society, a high trust society, that we have this innate response that we must speak truth to each other, right? And that helps us organize it better. Well, all that stuff is true. But again, look at his own life. It's like now he's in pain. He's been addicted to drugs. He can't be the intellectual he used to be. He's emotionally a mess. And what's the one thing he hasn't done is humble himself to God. And it seemed like that conversation with Paggio, it's like that's what he wanted to do. He's on the verge of tears. He's looking for something to hold on to. And you want to help him out. You want to help him. It's like I with you, I rag on. I've been very critical of Jordan Peterson because it's like he began to build a bridge, and it wasn't going to the other side. It's like, well, where was the bridge going? It just kind of stopped. And so it's like the Dyers of the world or the Paggios, they're building the bridge that he's building to the other side. The other side it's God. We're talking about non-physical things, archetypal patterns. How can patterns that are non-physical be objectively true all throughout the world? Makes no sense unless they already exist in a universal mind. And that's how we are accessing it. That's how we get these archetypal patterns, because our mind made in the image can access the divine mind, the logos. So for Peterson, it's like I think we all should probably pray for him and just hope that he can get to a place, because it feels like watching that conversation, it's like that's where you get. He's like, and I shouldn't judge. I'm not trying to judge, but maybe I'm just trying to give my perspective on what's going on. It's like that's where he is where you go with all his teachings without God. So take all the truth, but take God and theology out of it.
Yeah.
And you're there. It's not that he's not an honest person. It's not that maybe he's trying to do something good he may have all that stuff, but without God, without the transcendent foundation to all of your ideas, what do you have?
Right. Well, it's just like praying to nobody for your food. Like thanking who? Like thank what? What are you talking about? Oh, it's the universe. Like the universe isn't, the universe doesn't, there's no universe guy like oh, you're welcome for the
Right.
No, it has to be a person to person. There has to be a personhood, there has to be a connection, and there has to be faith and humility. And ultimately that's the part where someone like him and many who follow him and many in his realm, is his little direct realm there. And I get it. I'm an intellectual snob. I spend most of my time arguing for God, starting at a philosophical or logical or reasoning perspective, because I'm dealing with people. They're not dealing with the fact that they have to actually start from faith and start from doctrine and all these things. They're not there yet. So in a way, I'm the same bridge, but so I understand that dance of like making it accessible.
Yep.
You got to make it sound. It's got to be reasonable. It has to still make sense. It still has to be coherent. It still has to you have to be able to argue it to some extent. But as many know, beyond that, you can't get to God through those paths. You can't. Ultimately, it's humility and complete submission. Really, I mean,
Right.
it's like it's the thing that ironically makes a man, but what looks like the opposite of what a man is in the world. So submitting to other men doesn't look like the masculinity, but for some reason submitting to God is the closest form to the masculine
Right.
spiritual body. And
Right.
you're
Well,
like,
and that
it's
I
such a
yeah.
parallel thing where it's like, oh, it's like, I couldn't flesh this out. Maybe you could help me. It was like this idea of when you've done videos on how like the femininity, the divine feminine is taking over, and
Mhm.
why are men being led by women, and why are women acting like men, and like, I'm a leader, it's like, and all this stuff you're seeing, you're like, oh, it's this invert. We understand how to describe it, we know it, what it is spiritually. It's not a big surprise. But I was thinking about how when men put their faith in men, themselves or other men, the Fauci or whoever Trump, whatever. It's actually a feminine trait. Not that women should put their faith in men, but in God. But if men are the embodiment and they're the
Yep.
first tier
Right.
representing God, um, if men put their faith in other men, they're actually in the world exhibiting a female trait, and
Right.
in a way, it would create a condition uh, for men to follow women, because there's no
Exactly. No, and
separate.
that's
There's
the
no
original
separation.
fall. So right. So what's the correct authority of creation? God, man, woman, children. And it's not that man, the masculine principle is more important than the female principle. That's not, because they both are created by God. It's that they have different roles. And so what do we see with the fall is that the woman has a proclivity to listen to the world given to her natures that make her and have her unique role. So she can't be the nurturer. She can't relate to the children like she does. She isn't have a disposition more prone towards the world. So we see Eve more prone towards the world, listens to the serpent. Serpent tells her to do something that God told them not to do. She does it. So opposite of the theological dictates, right? But we don't fall when Eve eats the apple, right? When Eve ate the apple, it's not like Adam came back and knew they were naked, and it didn't happen until the man listened to the woman and not God, right? When man turned away from God and listened to the woman, humanity fell. And that's exactly what the world is doing. And that's exactly why tribal traditions, goddess centered religious traditions, are the exact inversion of what Christianity would teach, of what we would consider a patriarchal tradition with delineations, boundaries, distinctions. And so when you look at tribal societies, shamanistic societies, often there's a divine goddess figure. And the divine goddess figure is the earth, usually, or it's the local geography, or it's whatever it is. But then you look at what's the role of men in that society. So if we just based on the biblical understanding, so now let's look at the tribal and just from that vantage point look at, well, what's the role for men? Men are there they still hunt, they still provide. But when it comes back to the tribal setting, it's much more matriarchal. And so they'll have full moon orgies. So what does that do? Well, that destroys paternal lineage. That is a major, major deal, because again, what are we interested? We're children from the Father, God. And that we trace paternal lineage is a big deal within biblical text. But in a goddess tribal tradition, because we have full moon orgies and everybody's sleeping with each other, nobody knows actually whose child is whose, right? So the men don't know, the women know who their child is, but the group, the collective, raises the children. And that's exactly what we're seeing with the state. And that's what they want to move to. And so as they feminize society, as they feminize men, as they move us back towards a goddess-centered society, we're going to see a destruction of paternal power in regards to rearing children and raising children, because that is such a big deal. So then when we look at the destruction of the father, the destruction of the nuclear family, paternal lineage, these are foundational attacks on Christianity at a theological level that most people just are totally oblivious to. They're not thinking about these things.
Yeah, it's so palpable. I call it the daycare governance. "Mommy Knows Best" is a song that was in a Disney movie called Tangled, which was the movie of Rapunzel in quarantined in her tower, let out by the mother governance to then be free, but and so in the city of Corona, of course. And so this is everywhere. This is especially present in New Zealand, but like this whole thing, this whole move over to. I also see this pattern. I was looking at this show called I Care a Lot, and it's like, it's this inverted show, of course, where these power duo lesbians. This woman is a caretaker for the state, and so she's a scam artist. She goes to these old people who have money, who have their savings, and she basically it's a conservatorship. And I don't know if you've seen, like, a lot came up in the last year or two about Britney Spears, and they're like, what is this? Like, and these people come in and they convince the person and the state and the people around the people that they need help, that they need to be taken care of. This is the feminine force.
Exactly.
We're
Yes.
going to
Oh,
force feed
exactly.
you.
Socialism, communism, the
Yeah,
state can.
yeah. We
That's
need
it.
to take care of you.
It's a feminine force.
And it's crazy how it's actually legal at the individual level, because you can get a judge who's friendly with whatever you call the conservator, to take over the conservatee if the conservatee doesn't have any family or strong, legal defense. Where, and it's happening with this whole nonsense too, because as a collective, through that new feminine leadership, through that style. And that's not to say that people like Justin Trudeau can't embody feminine leadership. It's like the feminine leadership can still come from an emasculated
Yes.
man.
Yes. And that's why they want to emasculate men, because,
Right.
and that's why they love the transgenders. They love the lady boys. They love a woman with a dick.
Right.
Because I know that's kind of crass for some people, but that
Yeah.
really is it, because it's so anti-God. It's such an inversion. The man receiving anal, it embodies the total inversion.
Yeah, it's
Is the
complete.
transgender man.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what's getting it more and more popularized. Um, and so it's so clear. And back to, like, we were talking about pragmatism and how we're always vulnerable to the worldliness of fighting the spiritual, which is the outer worldliness. We're always drawn to the earth when our goal is toward heaven. And how that could be actually, talking about symbols, is like, people think heaven and earth were created, and it's like these distinct places, like locations, versus additionally, that they represent the immaterial and the material. And we're always drawn to fixing things and fighting things in the world. Like, oh, even though everything we argue for or want is actually not of the world.
Right.
And so we're in this moment where, when you were saying that, how all of this threatens the in-world uh, way of expressing a Christian life. The higher, the patriarchal, that through the father, mother, that family structure, that the view of doing that. In the end, when we're arguing, we're fighting for what we're fighting for. It's almost like important to reduce it to strict theology in a way.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost your best stance, because if you get into utility and you go, well, I have rights, you're toying with, again, the same way you're arguing with the simulation people, or arguing with the classical foundationalists,
Or Lil Nas.
You're fighting material with material claims. You're fighting material claims with material claims.
Right.
And
you have to use the weapon that conquered the world.
Right, exactly. So you play their game, and a lot of people I see today who are on the right side of things, and how they're summarizing what's going on and where they want to go and how we ought to behave and so forth. But we're all very vulnerable to this idea that, like, well, no, we'll appeal to the Constitution. Like, ultimately, when you look at I look at this, I have family members that have taken the V, and no, it's sheepish, no, it's nonsense, and they're just trying to get back to some weird structure of normalcy, which some structure that tells them who they are in the world and that they can maintain themselves, right?
Right.
And so there's a lot of people who are kind of in a weakened state, and I was thinking about how lost my train of thought. How ultimately you're playing a game that on a spiritual level is so minuscule. Like if you look back at stories in the Bible, what men had to do to show their faith, their faith was tested.
Right.
Just ridiculous examples that are, here we deal with, are you going to do this? Are you going to, like I want my donuts. I need to go back to Walmart, so I have to, like the things that are being threatened for us at this point are so minuscule compared to the other tests of faith in history. And I was talking to my mom about that. I was just like, it's insane how we're at a level where most people's just very superficial threat of inconvenience is enough. It's not your son will, kill you let your son die, or we're gonna execute you if you don't denounce Christ. Like it's not brutal. It's
Right.
like this is like you
You get
can't go to
somebody
the man.
calls you a mean name.
Yeah, exactly. Or
Good.
you can't go see you can't see the Knicks this weekend.
Yeah.
It's like the test. I mean, that not to demoralize, but it's like if that's the indicator, if that's the barometer for where people are, um, who even claim to have some spiritual aspect, some faith, some faith in Christ, and they're still trading everything just for what? For potato chips? For maybe the cross to bear is going to be economic. Maybe it is
Yeah.
going to be being the lepers,
Yeah.
being the lepers of society
And
and
that's how
being
we'll know
outcast.
Christ is with us because that's who he
Yeah.
stays with.
Yeah, and it's like that's it. And the meek, they'll have the first shall be last. They'll have their good smart cities. They'll have Amazon deliver hand feeding them ramen, just pouring it down their neck right from
Right.
their rooftops. They'll get all of this stuff is really in our future. I mean, the tech is going to always
Right.
cater to the appetites, and the appetites are always going to be sped up in efficiency, and it's really just like that Wally World thing, and we all see it coming. It's
Yes.
just that the question is, how do you fight it spiritually if not in the world, and how do you play a part in the world but not be of the world, and I don't think any of us have the true answer to that, because again, we can't be the judge as to how much of that is occurring and not occurring. It's like, no, that was not, I was not being in the world there. It's like
Yeah.
our own defenses of our godliness that we secretly write down in the journal that we have. We're like, just check,
Right.
3 checks
No,
today.
I want to connect because you're going to, I feel like this is the perfect segue when you're talking about these smart cities. And one of the things that I've been talking about more recently was with Marsh Mcluhan. And so those of you who aren't aware, Marsh Mcluhan is really, he's basically the technological genius of the 20th century. And so in the 1960s, he was talking about how technology, how mediums, the ways in which you acquire information is very, very important. People weren't even thinking about this. But he made very intricate and very interesting theories. He was a Catholic. That your your sense ratios is what he called them. Your sense ratios, how your sensual perception in which you acquire information is altered based on the mediums you use. So he talked about how the alphabet, what he would call a literate society, one that uses the alphabet, began with the Greeks, and writing makes people have a dominant visual sense. Now, I'm going somewhere with this, so continue to
Like
follow me, people watching.
physical,
Yeah.
like physical writing. Yeah.
Yeah. So writing and reading with an alphabet creates a dominant visual sense. And so he talked about how this was the case beginning with the Greeks and Christianity. And so thinking about that, we can see how the word, the logos, the source of language itself, the alpha and the omega, the beginning and the end of the Greek alphabet, right, spread around the world through reading and writing. And so what Marsh Mcluhan talked about is that our sense ratios have been drastically and continue to be altered by the increase of electronic mediums. And so first it was radio, and then he was talking about television and how television is what he would call a cold medium. It's a receptive medium. So when you sit and watch television, television happens to you. He would call that a cold medium. A hot medium is when you read. You have to read. You listen to the radio. You have to listen. That's a hot medium. That's what it's about, your intention and the focus you have to acquire the information. And he'd say, and that more information is actually picked up through the hot mediums. These are better forms of communication. But the cold mediums, like the television, he was talking about how it's altering our sense ratios and bringing us back to a tribal society. Because in a tribal society, the number one dominant feature is your ears, that you become an acoustic dominated individual. And by doing that, it totally changes your world. That when you're an acoustically dominated sense, if you were to look at a graph of sound, wherever I am, when I hear something, the sound is rippling around me. I'm in the center of that noise. Now, the noise could be over there, doesn't matter. It's just my experience of it. I'm always in the center. That's not the case when you have a visual dominated society. So we are moving towards an acoustic dominated society, which everybody is the center of their own world. It assumes relativism, and it moves us back to a tribal society, which already then moves us towards a feminist society. And so when you're talking about the smart city, it's totally consistent with the ideas and the patterns Mcluhan was seeing in the 1960s, that the electrical mediums is tribalizing man, and it's not elevating us. It's not moving us back towards God if there's a real purpose of progress, right? Which what God would want. That's what Christ would want. But Christ spread through reading and writing. And so in Christ, what was the big thing? That he is the light of the world. He gives sight to the blind. And so how interesting I thought it was that when we read and write, we gain a visual dominated sense. Is that not actually being able to see when before we were blind?
Right.
And so we are now moving. And so us doing this right now, we're contributing to the acoustification of the world, which we can't help. But we can, as he said, become aware of these things and start to control our medium diet, the diet in which the media that we take in. And that personally, he wouldn't put this out in his academic work, but personally, children need to, from the ages up to 7, once you're about 7, your senses are pretty well fixed, how you acquire information. That's why giving the iPad to the kids is so detrimental. You're literally putting them so far behind other people in regards to literacy and writing. And you're going to see it in their vocabulary skills, this ripple effect from the technology. So that is moving us to these smart cities. It's moving us to a feminized world. And I couldn't help but think that coincided then with where I wanted to go with the symbols. And that the other angle on this whole conversation on simulation is that, yes, there's the simulation theory, that reality is at its fundamental level illusory. But there's also, I think, another interesting way we can approach the idea of a simulated reality, and that's just looking at semiotics. The use of symbols, rhetoric, language, all these things in of themselves are analogical. They're an analogy to something, right? When I say flower, that's not the flower. Right. It's an analogy to the flower. And so the majority of our reality is symbolic. We exist in a symbolic world, whether we're aware of it or not. And therefore, and this is why I wanted to kind of open it up to you, is that we're in a symbolic war. And that the symbols then, depending on where you're at in this warfare, is you're using symbols to bring somebody to reality, or with the simulation, or with the smart cities, the propaganda, right? The inversion, that there's infinite numbers of gender, that men have periods. Or you use the symbols and you invert the world and you push people further away from God, further away from reality, further away from truth. Yeah. And I think comedy and what you do with your comics is a perfect example of what that does. People don't engage with all these highfalutin ideas that you and I go back and forth with, but they can look at your comic and that can immediately shake their worldview, change their perception, and bring them closer to reality itself.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting because the symbols, it's like when you look at what's being presented, it's the symbol is, like inversion, men can have periods. This is Nas is good, little Nas is this is
Yeah.
good. This we're
Perfect role
breaking
model
things
for
down,
children.
they end up hijacking the symbol of like sort of like freedom, where where the idea of liberty has been hijacked, separated from discipline, and just given its own wings to be like, you do whatever you want. That's liberty. You can be whoever you want. Believe in yourself. These are all symbols of, I guess, the transcendental possibility of humanity, right? It triggers, imagine all the people, all of these things are symbols, gestures toward what, funny enough, is toward the concept of a good. They don't have the basis for good, but
Right.
it's always toward good.
At
What they
least the
think is
rhetoric, the
yeah,
rhetoric of it. Because if you
yeah,
ask
the
them to
rhetoric. It's
define
always
what
yeah,
that is,
exactly. It's always appealing to the good. Actually, that's when it really comes down to, because the idea of like free, be free. You ultimately ask why, and you say, well, it's good, because everything will end up being a moral claim,
and that's perfect theologically. Again, the father of lies. What can theologically, we don't believe Satan or the fallen Lucifer. He can't create. He's not creative because that would be an energy of God. So what
Right.
he can do is distort, manipulate, and lie. That's his weapons. That's how he affects the world. And so when you look at the propaganda, when you look at these obvious, absolute inversions, right? Everything is a faux presentation. I saw there's the
Counterfeit.
biggest tower in Munich, Germany, said vaccination equals freedom. That is just the absolute inversion. It's using these symbols, right, to appeal to people's notions of what they mean, and then and so the symbols then move them to the simulation, right? The vaccine, the AI, the smart cities, that is the simulation, and the manipulation of these words and symbols is the conduit. And so when you do with your comics, what I try to do with words, we're using symbols, but we're trying to bring people away from a machine, an
Yeah.
absolute machine that has so much force.
Yeah, it seems like the real work is, as far as if you're going to get someone uh, thinking or stopping in their tracks of what they've accepted as nonsense, and they don't realize it's nonsense, is a form of just like, I mean, I'm lucky enough to be in a field of drawing and using very small amounts of words to reveal nonsense, but it's just a little bit clearer now where um, what I'm doing, what we're all trying to do in some sense is present the false e- equivalence. Like, this is that. That's what the world is saying. And you
Right.
go, if that's true, then this is that is also true. And the second phrase is always showing how ridiculous the first
Right.
phrase is.
Oh, that's
And
perfect.
it's
Yeah.
not telling you or correcting what is exactly the truth. It's only ripping down the veil, at
Yes.
least.
Yeah,
At least,
it's exposing Oz. We can't take you to Wonderland, or we can't take you
right,
back home from Wonderland. We can't take you to Kansas, but we can sure as hell rip that curtain down and show you that Oz, who's behind the machine,
right.
and
Yeah.
it's Bill Gates in a pink sweater, pushing out his needle.
It's really you know it takes it actually takes a weight off to know that, because it's all a lot of rhetoric and a lot of symbols that you're dealing with. Exposing it isn't this big screaming war, because the way the world is inverted isn't through screaming and all of that. It's not like it's all this subtle and sometimes explicit forms of equating one symbol with something that's not equal to, and presenting it falsely. Man is woman, man is rooster. Like, we are animal. These things,
Right.
and they're basically constantly saying X, A equals B,
Right.
A equals B, and all you have
All
to
the
do is
time.
the battle is showing where that's not true. It's like I've been listening in on a lot of like science stuff and like determining what science is and isn't, and how all these other forms are presented as science. And this one meme in this kind of war, because there is a war between in that world where people are presenting models, or they're trying to pretend that math is science, and it's like math is math. It's a language. It's just descriptive. You have to actually have to appeal to math in a faith, basically, to even do science. So it's math. There's no experiment that demonstrates in the physical that 2 + 2 = 4. We must accept the law of identity, the value of numbers. And so there's always this thing is like math is science. People, all these people, scientisms, I call them. I don't know what to call the people who are scientism people.
Yeah.
There's not a catchy word for them yet. But that one I've been recently working on is, one guy says math is science, and the other person says, tape measure is carpentry. And it's like that's an example of the inversion that occurs and how to expose why it doesn't make sense, why the first frame doesn't make sense, the first statement. And it seems like we're constantly operating in a communication of these statements. Like, they go back to the Nas thing. This is good. This is free.
Right. This is
lap
freedom.
dance the devil. This freedom is good. We're breaking down old structures. We're breaking down traditional values and all these. We're freeing ourselves.
Can you believe people hated this? Right. So we're preventing hate by allowing Lil Nas X to do this, because only bigots, only people who hate would be against it.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's cool to look at it through that view, because I never looked at my stuff as that symbols were actually being relayed in any way, because my idea of symbols is always trapped visually with it's like a thing with a circle around it, and it's like that's a symbol. But there's actually that interaction, metaphors, analogies. We're constantly we're stuck.
Yeah, we're swimming in an analogical world,
right?
And most people aren't aware of that, right? So there's a famous phrase. Oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the famous linguist, but he used to say the map is not the territory, right? So the map is all the analogies, but that's not the territory. That's not the actual terrain. That's not reality,
right?
And most people,
just like the 7 isn't equal to the 7 coconuts. People is still not the person. I mean, that just goes on and on. That's the whole one and the many problem it gets into. The whole issue of is the chair, or is the part of the chair? Where's the chair start? Where does the chair start? And you can't ever answer it. And then the idea, the name of the chair is not identical exactly to the chair itself either. It's but then it's that's funny. We were talking in the beginning about how the nihilist, you could see how that view can potentially, it's like a tightrope leaning toward epistemic nihilism, where nothing can be known.
Right.
So you have to eventually appeal outside of all of these systems and know that there's a grounding, coherent, present mind, that can justify any of this stuff. Otherwise it all falls apart, and we might as well just be making fart sounds, which is a likely future in the future of the smart city, where the sounds you're making physically in your living room when you're running on a treadmill and being fed by some robot arm while you're fighting things in Ready Player One, you might not need to even make any sound. You're just dribbling. But in the world, you're saying all of this stuff to this other virtual being.
No,
that's soon. That's soon.
Well, when you were talking about the divine mind and everything, adding on to that, there are other theologies that have this sort of unified divine mind. But again, where I think that would fall apart is where, again, Peterson was pleading to Paggio why do I have to believe in the physicality of this mythology for his framework? It's a myth. It's this great myth. It's the ultimate myth, right? There's no greater myth than this myth. This is the limitation of myth. But why do I have to believe in it physically? And because if it isn't physical, how is truth transmitted through those analogical symbols? Right? Because truth is a who. Truth literally is the logos. Truth is an uncreated energy. And so truth, archetypes are rooted in the logos, patterns, symbols, language, all these things are still rooted in the logos. And so how can this become physical? It has to be physical. It has to be physical, so then this truth can permeate all dimensions of reality. There isn't a place in which Christ, God, isn't, right? Other theologies say, well, God is outside time. God permeates time. But no religion claims that God limited himself purposely to be in time. Or God purposely took on human nature so he could die, so that he could kill death, because God can't die. And so only by God taking a body that can die can he then prevent death as a phenomenon itself. It's like once you start exploring this, it gives people, I think, a cognitive, logical approach to the faith that you have to believe in the literality of all this stuff. I can't go back and prove that Christ walked on water. I can't go, there's nothing I can do to prove when I say that Jesus Christ is God, and I believe that. There's nothing I can do to show that to somebody. All I can do is try to enunciate and articulate the depth that I see the theology being true and how it gives me an apparatus to look at reality. And then if all that is true, well, the only way that all of it is true is if it also actually historically, physically happened. Because then it is the ultimate story. It is the ultimate story. And that then actually can save us. And just the thought that might have actually happened, that gives you hope.
Yeah. Well, I thought about that too. And, growing up and all the skepticism I hit and all the rejection and everything I ran away from. And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, if truth is absolute and accessible, then there must be a physical way, a physical representation of absolute truth. Even though we appeal to the concept as a concept, so we have faith in the truth, we have faith in laws of logic, we can't materialize them and manipulate them. But if the truth is absolute and there's no other logical alternative to that, we know that, then a story, like that means the story of everything, all humankind, the entire story of existence must have a physical story. That is the truth.
It's the only it's the only way it could be.
Then it's like, then you realize there's only one story going on. Like there's not multiple stories. Like there isn't the story of those are all microcosm. Those are like, again, it's like the one and the many, but applied to story. Like, oh, I had my life was like this, and I lived in 2021. It's like, but the story of mankind can only be one story.
Right.
There's only one story of mankind, and then of course the implications of that is that there can only be objective morality, or it's illusory, and so it applies to every other item in that category that we appeal to. Even if you're an atheist, you appeal to it constantly. I mean, all of the atheists that I follow, that I check up on once in a while, the rationality rules, the Alex O'Connor guy, all these guys, they're constantly making moral claims. They're constantly making truth claims. They're constantly trying, because they're like us, to figure out what and who must be necessary to ground any of it for it to be true. And it's impossible to get away from the fact that it needs to be found at some point in history in the physical world. Otherwise, you can't know God. You go to Judaism, then you go to these other places where it's so abstract, it's out there. It's like you end up just going like, well, I'll just do what I think are good deeds, and then we'll just that's it. But it's why it's so necessary. And then people, it's a lot of people, and for good reason, have problem intellectualizing, rationalizing, like something like the Trinity, like why that's logically necessary, and why it's not actually important. It's not a prerequisite to try to understand in our limited mind what is that,
Right.
what, like, we can't,
Because if
just
it
the
is
same way
God,
we,
we can't put it in a
yeah,
box. It means
we
you
can't
can't
do that with
understand it.
infinity. We know infinity exists. We can't capture infinity. Like, we
Right.
can't conceptualize. And there's a lot of things like that. Like all of the whole Mandelbrot set. We know it exists.
Right.
We can't do that, but it's there. And
Right.
so how do we reconcile that we know something exists, but we can't get it in here in our way of doing it? And
Right.
so there's a problem, a lot of people have. It's like it's hard to get that, and to figure out, well, how can man be God and how can a man have a father and also be God? Is he also the father? How do you separate all of these
Right.
things? And it's the truth of the matter is it's can't be the same. It can't understanding that cannot be based on the man's our standard of what understanding is. And does
Right.
that make sense?
No, it
Like,
absolutely
it's
does.
it's not, we can't govern, we can't say, well, if that's the truth, then it must make sense in the way I understand all things. And it's just, that's fundamentally antithetical to God itself as a concept. We can't understand it. Like, we can't conceptualize how can everything, how can all existence be created? Because immediately we go to the material, because that's the only way we know how to
Right.
think of something. We go like this with our hands, it was created, like something, there's a burst and there's this stuff, and we're tied to the world, and we're tied to our minimal amount of thinking. But we know that transcendental reality exists. We know that there are concepts that exist that we can't conceptualize. Now, how can that be? How can we know infinity exists? It actually makes sense, but we can't possibly show you.
Right.
I can't show you it. And so it's like, it's one of those things where that's why I always try to bring people back to faith. You can't reason your way.
Yes.
You can't, you have to give up the agency and the authority of thought. I am, no, it, I set the rules that it has to make sense this way in my head. And ultimately, if we did that with everything, we'd be in a lot of trouble.
Right.
But I'd also say that anyone who's battling that, and there's a lot, I watched a whole stream of, what's his name? Tatum. He's like a black conservative ex-cop guy,
Oh
and
yeah, Brandon Tatum.
he was just like, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense. And it was just like, he was just rejecting, and he couldn't deal with it. Owen's gone through it. But the thing is, I I actually like to see that, because it means something's important.
Yeah, and they're
It's an
honestly searching. Yeah, they're
Yeah,
honestly
yeah,
searching.
they're not just like they're like, they're going towards it. And I know Owen. It's like, my faith and my understanding of how God works in my limited way is that people who want to pursue truth and have a love for truth, they will find the truth, and they'll find it in the way it clicks, or the way it happens in that way. And not that's I don't mean to teeter it on relativism. It's just that we all experience things and pursue it. But I know when people pursue it,
Right.
and that, to me, I go, okay, that's cool. I can't pretend to relay it in a way that he might understand it. I can't pretend to fix it in a way that Brandon will finally just go, oh, that makes sense. It's like that pursuit. I think the one key element is what I mentioned, though, is that you have to understand, at least going into it, that um, there'll be a limitation. There's always going to be a limitation of what our conception of things are. And if
Right.
we start making the rules for what that is, we're basically saying we create truth. We create the standards.
Absolutely. And with the Trinity, it is a difficult one because, again, Christianity is the only religion in the world that's making this claim. And it takes a little bit of sophistication to understand why that would be important. Because, again, it gets into the one and the many. It gets into these philosophical understandings of essence. So for easy ways to object, like when somebody says, well, if Jesus is God, how come he's praying to the Father who's also God? Therefore, I've made a logical demonstration he can't be God. No, you didn't, because when Jimbob has a daughter, she's also human, right? Because it's the essence that's passed on. It's the nature that's passed on. When God has a child, it's also God, because that's the essence. When I have a child, when a dog has a birth, it's still a dog. The nature is passed on. This is worked out in Greek philosophy.
Is that the energy essence distinction?
No. So the energy essence distinction is then highlighting how it is. Who do we interact with? When we interact with God, are we interacting with the essence? Because that brings up a huge philosophical problem. Because now we're claiming that we can know what the essence is because we interact with it. Mm. So now we've put God in a box. So whenever we say God is one, God has to be one, which is the presupposition of typically people who see the Father as the only God, right? There's the Father, and then there's like this Jesus and the Holy Spirit. I'm not sure what those things are, but they can't be God because they're working off a presupposition that's present in Islam. That's their presupposition. Same thing in Neoplatonism, that really God isn't God because the idea of singularity is actually trumps him. Right? God can't be God because God has to be one within that frame. That presupposition, the idea that God has to be all in one, actually limits God.
Right.
And so Christianity is trying to show you that that can't be the case because God can't be limited. So he can't be dialectical. Therefore, God can't also be in an internal fight with evil. That doesn't make sense. So that's why God is three persons, which creates multiplicity. Now we have the full example of what the one and the many is. One essence, multiplicity with three persons. All of them are God because they all come from the Father, and therefore they all share in the same essence. But how then do we interact with that God? That's where Orthodoxy would have the energy essence distinction. They would say, so how you interact with God then is through the energies. That these energies, and it's the same way that I interact with Jimbob, that how do I know Jimbob? Well, I don't know the essence of who Jimbob is. I don't know your nature. There's a lot of things that aren't even related to your nature that I don't know. But what I do know of you is through all your energetic activities, the way you talk, your comics, the things that you do. All these things have energy in it. You use energy to do that, and therefore it's an extension of who you are. I've interacted with those things. That's how I know who you are. And Orthodoxy says that's exactly how you come to know God. Because God is a person, and he's three persons. And it's through the energies of God that you interact with that you come directly in contact with him, but never his essence, because that would then insinuate that you know what that is. Right. And that's where the Catholics, with their absolute divine simplicity, that's where, again, Islam, Neoplatonism, with the oneness stuff. Now you've made a cataphatic. You've made an absolute positive claim on what that essence is. Right. And so now you're in a problem.
Yeah, that makes sense. Also, the praying too. Like I talked to my mom about this, and she loves this stuff because she gets to make the connections. She's truly an investigator in Scripture, and she was talking to me about the common references, why have you forsaken me? And what people need to understand about Christ is that he was the full embodiment of who God, he was all that God was, the fulfillment in the flesh. And so a lot of things that he said were actually like references or the fulfillment of previous prophecies or things that were said. And so in that example, if you go to, he's not saying, God, Daddy, why did you do this? He's reciting Psalm 22, and that is basically, I think it was David, and he was actually foreseeing the actual crucifixion all the way up to nails through hands. And so if he had finished, and this is my mom's gist of it, is that if Christ had finished that phrase, he would have eventually said, I am the fulfillment. Like he would have said, this was already said.
Right.
Like what's happening was said. Like I'm just saying it.
Exactly.
He's not saying, oh, why are you doing this to me? He's not talking. He's referencing. He's going back. And he did that multiple times, where he's saying something in the now, in the reality that was there, and then, but it was a reference. It was a recitation of something else.
And related to that exact passage in Scripture, Orthodoxy has this concept called kenosis, which is the self-limiting of God, which again, no other religion has this idea, that God being omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, that he actually went through what's called kenosis, that he self-limit, that he took all divinity and put that inside full humanity. And by doing that, at the same time, he was the Logos that's outside creation, but he's also Jesus Christ, the Logos inside creation. When he's inside creation, he's limited by human nature to a degree. Now, he obviously surpasses it. So I've heard Orthodoxy explain that verse, is that's just Christ, again, representing his human nature, is that he is going to actually feel, as a human would, that entire crucifixion.
Right.
But he's never going to deviate from the Father's will, because his will and him, they're the same will. And so what he did, because he's already three persons, one God, the Logos becomes man to finally, fully align a human will with God's will in entirety. And that's why now man can participate and become God. And that's the theology of that. But the Trinity can get tricky, and I understand people being frustrated with that idea, generally speaking.
It's also not just the idea. It's, especially knowing Owen, I know him personally, I chat with him a lot, and it's like he's going after something legitimate, which isn't actually identical to the idea. It's that people who appeal to it, who can't adequately understand it or justify it in a way that makes sense, is frustrating, because then it's just like,
because they believe in something heretical, that they don't understand.
It's heretical, and it's like he's just like, no, I want to know. Because his kid, it's like when we have kids, we want to be able to say the truth in a way that kids understand it, but that's not always the prerequisite for all things, because there's things later on in life that kids can't understand. But I totally understand I don't get all riled up about it, because I'm just like, I'm still pursuing how to understand in a way that I can relay it with limited language and abstract ideas. And in an analogous world, we live, like you said, and it's like, there's no way that concept's not going to be limiting if our standard is pushing it through the lens. The same way you talk to like a materialist, you can't argue, they'll always be interacting with their fundamental presuppositional view of all things. And so something like the Trinity isn't going to trickle down through the same format of how we understand knowledge and things, because we're fundamentally talking about God. So it's like, we're not talking about anything else. We could try to be analogous. We could be like space, time, matter all came into existence together at the same time. None of them could exist.
I thought you were getting ready to sing the Big Bang intro theme song.
Exactly. But there are plenty of things that are all one thing, and but also have distinct things. Like the laws of logic are three things, but they're all one thing that can't actually exist without the other two holding them up.
Exactly. There's logic, and then you have the laws of logic. So again, you have a singular, you have a multiplicity, and it takes a while for people to get into. As I think you would be a perfect example to talk about this whole logic thing, right? Now you do a stream now, and people are mystified at your angle on reality. But I'm sure for you and for me and it's like, really, I'm literally just trying to be consistent, and I want to follow through. And just by doing that, so many people don't do that.
Right.
That it looks like that you're like this wizard. You're coming up with these amazing ideas, and you're seeing, and all you're trying to do is like generally just use logic and try to think these things out in a systematic way.
Right.
But it takes time to get there. You don't just do it overnight.
Yeah, and I don't fully grasp the Trinity. I can get to the sense of everything you just said, but I can't, like, the notion, it's like our mind wants us to get it to some complete
Yes.
format that we
Yep.
can hold.
Yep.
And it's like that applied to anything else in the immaterial category, we couldn't possibly do it with any of those things. We can't
Exactly.
conceptualize the truth.
Right.
Like we can't, any we appeal to a lot of things. We can't possibly, it's all faith based. Like think of the laws of logic. Like we know they exist. We know we can't escape them. We know we abide by them. We know they're conceptual. And yet you couldn't visualize an image of them. Like you couldn't make them consistently identical to some representation in the reality in language or letters. Even if I write them down, the writing. If I wrote all three laws of thought, that writing and the piece of paper would not be identical to the laws of logic.
Right.
So that they're not identical. They're not like that's not even proof of them. That's just I just wrote them out with Cheerios for I wrote them out with sticks. I wrote them out in sand. The information itself is totally unjustifiable, like from a materialist standpoint.
Right.
Um, and so we're always dealing with the lens that we're already have on. But anyone who's having difficulty with that concept, why aren't you just as frustrated with the concept of God? It's just as limited.
Right.
You can't know. You can't. We can't. We don't have the capacity to embody that in our brains in a way that we're like, okay, yeah, because then it would be in, like you said, it would be in a box.
It'd be in a box, right?
You'd be able to take it out and be like, there it is.
And that's why Protestantism, unfortunately, because we live in that culture and the consequences of it, obviously, is that there's always a rational conclusion, and that was the problem with Protestant theology, is that because they were trying to break away from the church, they wanted nothing mystical. They didn't want open-ended problems in the theology. They wanted to close it off. They wanted to come to definite answers, and Orthodoxy does the exact opposite. When it comes to the Trinity, they'll give you arguments, but eventually they'll say, well, you're gonna have to pray about it. Depending on where you're at, it's gonna have to be given to you, because again, this stuff is mystery. This is mystical. This is beyond any ability to conceptualize or fully know. So it's a gift, really. It's a gift because God will give you it, I think, if you start walking in the light.
Well, you have to have, I don't know the scripture itself, but the love for the truth. And the truth can't be just this idea. It has to be a person, like you said. It has to be it has to come from a divine mind, an absolute being. And so the love, when they say the love, you have to have a love for the truth. You have to love God, really. I mean, it's all from wisdom. All comes from God. And so from there, you just, anyone who's having issues with that and they're getting stuck, it's like, I bet some of the frustration is that it's set up that you have to believe that. And that could be true. It's just that that's not an empowering context to explore a concept or an idea. It's that, I have to. So naturally, you're just going to be like, well, that was probably, men probably did that. You have to believe this. You're no Christian if you don't believe this. And that puts people in a corner. And it's not really, and that's the fault of how people respond to people actually asking or critiquing in a way. Like the response I see people giving Owen, that's like critical is fine, but when they go like full on, they're just insulting or just classifying him. And same thing with Brandon. I mean, I saw like 3/4 of his chat disappeared, and he was being pompous about it too, he was being away about it, but I saw that there was there's a need there. There's actually demand for this being able to express and understand this concept.
Well, and it's really important because Christianity is the only world religion who's making this claim. So if you don't adopt it, you really can't call yourself Christian, because the whole premise is built on this thing. Not that you're not that the morality, the worldview, the presuppositions are built in that fashion, but the Trinity then becomes a really important topic. It's difficult, like you said. You can't come to a definite conclusion. You can't come to an absolute rational end. But this is a big differentiator, although it takes a little bit of time to conceptualize, between us and almost every other world religion that's ever existed.
Well, I think it's great to explore why is it necessary and why does it make sense on every level that God becomes man, and as opposed to God anoints some pretty fashionable, popular guy.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
It's a very distinct. It's very subtle,
different approach.
Yeah, and it's like that would remove a lot of all of it. I mean, that would pull one of the Jenga pieces out of the entire thing if Jesus was just some dude, like he was just like no, he was just kind of like a prophet, cool guy. It removes the whole thing, because then you have to then connect it to all these other accumulative parts in the Bible. I mean, the whole point of, like, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but like the presence of God as a man in Christ is what separates, ultimately what pulls us away from old law and Old Testament and all of that stuff. It's just like, it's like almost like the new beginning of the story. But then you question, like, like, what is Christianity before Christ? And like, how do we know who God is then? How do we know what prophecies are correct or not? How do we ground God before God is grounded?
That's a very great question. One way the church tried to deal with that, and this will be the last thing. We got some super. I didn't mean to. I'm not trying to keep you too long. I know you got a family.
I have to get ready soon too. I have to cook for my kid.
Okay, we can hop, and you can get off if you need to at any time. I wasn't trying to keep you so long. It's just we keep.
No, it's interesting.
So you were, God, I just lost it. What was the last thing you said that was so interesting about?
Well, I was saying that if the embodiment of God comes as Christ in physical form, and that's how we know God.
Oh, yes.
How do we know God before Christ?
Right. So there's a few different approaches. The first one is that, so if God, so assume the narrative that the world is fallen and humanity has all these different gods, all these different religions, and God wants to begin a process to prove the one true faith. So how does he start this? He finds a single human being, Abraham, and then he begins what we would call the tradition of Israel, the lineage of Israel. And so he has all these prophets. So he chooses a group to draw boundaries and absolutely divide themselves from the rest of the world. And then over time, they have these prophecies, paternal lineage, all this different stuff. And so we can look at the fulfillment of prophecies for Christ. But in regards to a global scale, there's a really interesting idea called logos spermaticos, which was developed by St. Justin Martyr. This is the idea that logos, or Christ, or truth, can still be present before Christ existed. And this is where we get ideas about Christ, the eternal Tao, looking at Taoism and saying, you know what, Lao Tzu, he came really close. All he could do is observe nature. He didn't have revelation. He didn't have, again, Christ there at the Last Supper to tell him the true mystery. But he got really close. And so Christianity, orthodoxy, says logos spermaticos is the idea that seeds of Christ, seeds of logos, seeds of truth are all over the world. You can find it in paganism. You can find it in Hinduism. You can find it in an African tribe. Just like the idea of a solar religion, right? People want to say, oh, that Jesus, he's a solar god. Don't you know about Mithras? Don't you know about Apollo? Don't you know about Horus in Egypt? And it's like, no, again, from our perspective as Christians, the logos spermaticos says, though all those are representations to lead you to the one ultimate truth. And so when you look at the archetypes, so just like the theosis, just like the Illuminism then in the magic, all these things are present all over the world, and they're all trying to point you towards the objective truth.
It's just like the sense of morality can be, you can sense morality. Like the argument, morality, we can sense morality, which is separate from being able to ground it logically in a being, in the life of someone, in the representation of it. But the sense of morality and good and right and wrong has always been present. And it's almost like similar to what you're saying, that the resolution in which we apprehend this over time can be accumulative and still true.
Yes, exactly.
And that the sense of morality, even morality is the case, or truth itself, the things that we know of the world at least, and of metaphoric truth too, is that it always comes in higher resolution, and there's always there's a provenance to its apprehension. We understand it over time, but it never goes further away. We never lose. Like, if, in other words, let's take morality, for instance. People are like, well, morality is relative. There's people who thought, this happened back then, and they believed this was moral and stuff. But if you really look at it, it's come into greater resolution over time. Even from the empirical materialist who tries to ground it in, like, how people are treated generally, or the standard of living generally. Like, even those are incorrect formats, but even by their standard, morality doesn't look like this over time.
Right.
Like, it looks like the real estate market.
Right.
So yeah, I totally get that. I mean, that makes sense to me.
And one of the reasons why that logos pragmaticos idea is useful is because it helps us. So the problem with perennialism, if somebody was saying a similar concept of this idea that truth can be present in all these different world religions, perennialism, though, assumes what epistemology to say this. They don't have an epistemology to say that. So any Westerner who says, no, they all lead to the same place, based on which Hindu epistemology? Is it the African tribes epistemology? Which is it? Is it Western secular post-Enlightenment epistemology? What epistemology are you using? With us, we're using traditional logos theology. We have an epistemology. We have an objective morality, just like you're saying, to then look into the world and find it in other places.
Gotcha.
So if you don't have that objective epistemology, I don't know how anybody can go about then trying to make those objective claims in the multiplicity of traditions. But anyways, brother, thank you so much. We have do you have a minute, or you got to go right now?
1 minute or two.
Okay. So let's just bust through some of these super chats real quick. We have Pano, good Orthodox buddy, threw in $5, and he said, practice prolonged fasting, 48 to 72 hours of no food. Ooh, don't know if I could do that. Including hardcore dopamine detox to heal your mind from all these demonic symbols. Live apophatically. Well, I don't disagree with people probably should do that. It would be very difficult for myself. You have any thoughts on that?
Oh, well, I went on a soup cleanse. That was as close to fasting. I'm actually capable of fasting if I just get a lot of water. It's pretty fun once you're past that first terrible moment. But that sounds good. It's harder to do.
Yeah, it's definitely hard to do. And for me, the dopamine detox, I'd probably have to take a few days off the old business to do that. But it is a good suggestion. And I think many of us, I've talked about how my attention focus changes when I'm more on social media earlier in the day than if I don't and I read in the morning, that I could just feel a difference.
That's good.
Anyways, Panel also threw in $2 and said, can video games be hot mediums? McLuhan definitely didn't talk about video games, but I think that you could make an argument for it being a hot medium in regards to the intensity of focus that you use. But that would be an interesting conversation. I'd have to think a little bit more about that one. But thank you very much, Pano, for the $2 and then the $5 super chat. Drew Tanner threw in $20 and said, Open Ancient Eyes wanted me to donate this to let you know that she is now praying for both of your souls.
Oh, thank you.
I don't know who that is. Do you?
That's a troll on my account who has become a meme. She's basically like a very new agey Christian. She takes it to that level. She looks like a what I said, like a what did I say? A Burning Man action figure, like a Burning Man. So she inspired a whole line of a potential collection of Burning Man action figure. Thanks.
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah.
We also have a couple more. Oh, Zach Hardley threw in $4.99. Thank you very much, Zachary. Greatly appreciate it. No comment. Stevie threw in $5. He said, "This is for the gravy." Well, thank you very much, Stevie. Greatly appreciate that. Jordan also threw in $10 with no comment. So thank you very, very much, Jordan. And I think that is all the super chats. Let me just double check on Streamlabs 1 second. That come through. Come on. And that does look like it was it. So I will let you go, brother. I know you got things to do. Thank you so much, man, for coming on. This was a lot of fun. Always enjoy when you're able to get some free time to hop on and have another conversation.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. Yeah, we'll do this again soon. Just look at the topics we can cover.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody, please smash that like. Go follow Jimbob on Instagram at MadeByJimbob. And please check out the website for davidpatrickcarey /register if you're interested in exclusive content. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Thank you to everyone who